All right, so I'm Ben Hodges, the Pershing Chair for CEPA, and I have the privilege of moderating Panel 4, The Future of Warfare, New Domains and Transformations. So today we've talked a lot about the alliance, we've talked about international relations, we've talked politics, but at the end of the day, our great alliance, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is all about collective security. So we're going to talk a little bit this afternoon about how the alliance, and particularly how the United States Army, is preparing for fighting against a peer adversary, whether it's the Russian Federation or China, but specifically how we would fight against the Russian Federation over the next 20 years. The dividing lines between war and peace and between kinetic and non-kinetic warfare are blurring. Conflict in cyberspace, information and influence operations, the use of economic power for political ends, and the potential of space technology can now decide victory and defeat without a clear traditional battlefield. Meanwhile, the layering of standoff capabilities in all domains, land, sea, air, space, cyberspace, is creating a dizzying pace of change for civilian and military decision makers. What are the kinds of capabilities that the United States and our allies will need in order to compete, deter, and win in this environment? If our understanding of the problem is clear, how strong is our resolve to commit the resources and political will to address it? What is the role of defense industrial cooperation, and where can America's allies make their greatest contribution? Our panel today includes Major General retired John Gronsky. Many of you know John, great U.S. Army National Guardsman, commanded the 28th Division of the Pennsylvania Army National Guard, where he really caught my attention of making sure that guardsmen were ready to fight and contribute to deterrence in Europe. In fact, he was so good, I asked the Guard, please let me have him to be my deputy. And so he was our first National Guard deputy for U.S. Army Europe, where he spent almost 3 years. Next to him, Lieutenant General Eric Wesley, who was the Deputy Commanding General, Army Futures Command and the Futures and Concepts Center. I've known Eric Wesley for quite some time. We first met, he was a very much younger armor colonel, about to become a brigade commander. He was the worst of the 10 colonels that I was responsible for mentoring, but I was such a good mentor that he somehow overcame all that, and look what happened. He grew into a dynamic lieutenant general, and I'm happy to see that the Army picked Eric to help make sure that the Army is prepared to be a part of a joint force working with allies, fighting with allies for the future. And then finally, Minister Wild from Poland. Minister Wild is the state secretary within Poland's infrastructure ministry. Now you might think, well, this is an interesting panel, or unusual panel. We've got a U.S. Army National Guard general, a U.S. Army general, and then you have basically the number one vice minister inside a Polish ministry responsible for infrastructure. This is not an accident. Part of deterrence is the ability to get there, to move as fast or faster than Russian forces can move in order to convince them they do not want to fight against our great alliance. And so Minister Wild is here to be able to help provide expertise about infrastructure, about host nation support, and of course he'll give an allies perspective on the future. Now we're going to use the famous CEPA panel format, which means no opening statements. Instead, we go right to questions, and what I'll do, I'll ask each of our panelists, I'll ask them a direct question, and then I'll ask them to a follow-up question, and then I'll go to the next panelist and the next panelist. And then I've also encouraged them, especially since we're the last panel of the day, that crossfire is also welcome, that they can challenge each other, or maybe, hey, I'd like to add something to an excellent point you just made. We do have about an hour and a half, and I promise to save the last 20 to 30 minutes for questions from the audience here. And whoever asks the best question, and I'm the only judge, I will buy you a gin and tonic at the hotel bar when we break. All right? Whoever asks the worst question or doesn't ask a question, and I think you should have, then you will have to buy me a gin and tonic, Dr. Dale. Okay, so See if this works, transition. So my first question is going to be to General Wesley. Eric, you were not the worst.
I was going to say, why would you go to the 10th Colonel to lead off, sir?
Burleson was much worse than you were, but you're doing good. Okay, Eric, what is the Army doing to be ready for the next 20 years in Europe against a peer adversary? You were just in Europe, in Poland and in Germany. You had a chance to look at what is the problem that we're trying to solve here?
Well, sir, I think you hit on the key question, because if you understand the problem, you can start getting after a unified solution. We define the problem as three factors in Europe right now, particularly focusing on Russia, but also applies to China. And the first one is they have invested in all domains to challenge us in all domains. That's probably something you've heard before, but it's really important because much of the way we have fought over the last 30 years is based on an understanding that we dominate in all domains. Ubiquitous comms, we have control of the skies, and you're going to fight differently if those are challenged. So that's a really important factor in terms of what the problem is. The second is our peers have invested in multiple layers of standoff, which has only gotten worse and become exacerbated by the fact that we withdrew from the continent and we withdrew to a degree from the peninsula. And then the third problem is our adversaries' willingness to leverage the competition space to achieve their objectives, both strategic and operational, which is a bit of a challenge for Western democratic nations, and it has implications for where we're going. I can talk you through how we might reconcile those three things, that is, challenge in all domains, multiple layers of standoff, and this idea of leveraging the competition space. But the net effect is we think that this has diluted to a good degree our operational deterrence, therefore must be reconciled.
So when you say challenge in all domains, I mean, obviously the land domain, but what's the Army's role? How is the Army going to challenge in the other domains?
Just to be clear in the question, how are we challenged in all the other domains?
Right, I mean, when you say we, do you mean we the Army or we the U.S.? How do we compete in all domains?
Yeah, clearly this is something that all of us are going to deal with. All nations, not just armies, but our ability to leverage policy will all be influenced by the cyber domain, space, electromagnetic spectrum, the maritime, land, and also air. And if you're challenged, what that means is that you no longer necessarily have overmatch. We're used to having overmatch, and the only way you can create overmatch when all domains are in play is to create synergy between them so that the total is greater than the sum of the parts. We don't have enough resources to ensure that the U.S., our partners, and our allies always dominate all the time in all domains. So to create overmatch, you need to create synergy between them, which really has implications for synchronization of the battlefield, but also policy.
So our friends, our sister services, Air Force, Navy, Cyber Command also, are they, how is the Joint Staff bringing everybody along on this, or the other services cooperating with the Army's efforts in the multi-domain thinking?
Yeah, sir, this is a great question, because what the services invest in is critical that we have some kind of consensus. And I think what you're going to see over the course of the next year is move to a joint concept on how we're going to fight in the future. But right now you see a convergence of ideas between the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. Particularly in the Air Force, we're all but eye to eye in that there's an agreement that the number one problem that the Joint Staff has to solve in the coming years is joint multi-domain command and control, or joint all-domain command and control. The Vice Chairman, Joint Chiefs, directed us to solve this problem, and just said in a phrase, what we want the services to be able to do to fight in a theater environment is to leverage any sensor for any shooter through any C2 node in near real time. That's a big change in terms of how we conduct fires. It's going to require artificial intelligence. It's going to require some significant data lake capability.
So obviously we're going to have to fight, not at the National Training Center, that's where we prepare, but if we're fighting, it's going to be in Europe or Korea or Middle East. What in the future, what are sort of the expectations of allies, host nation support, for example, as you think about how the Army deploys, how we would operate in these different theaters? How do host nation support, host nation capabilities factor into the thinking that y'all are doing?
This is really important, Ben, and this is why we're here, right? In many ways, this effort these last days is to galvanize an understanding of what needs to happen. One of the things, there are a number of things we could talk about, but first and foremost, I would say in order to adequately deter in a European environment, there is this idea that we aren't used to, and that is competition left of conflict. We've been lulled into an idea that we have security and if nothing else, extended time to prepare for vulnerabilities to a lack of security. In the future conflict, because of the hyperactive pace of the battlefield, we anticipate that the winner of the first battle will be at a distinct advantage. Which means you don't have the luxury to take extended months to mobilize not only from the United States or CONUS, but also to galvanize NATO in a way that can put together a coherent campaign over extended months, but rather have to be rapidly available to transition to conflict. So therefore, one of the first things we need the nations to do is, with unity, compete left of conflict. And I could talk to some detail what we think competition means, but that's operational headquarters that are conducting competition every single day in an aggressive and rapid manner.
So, okay, how about build on that then? What does, when you talk about competition, left of conflict, I like that phrase, what are some of the specific things that you'd be talking about?
Yeah, I would first tee it up with this and say that in many ways we find this difficult in Western democratic nations, particularly the United States, because we don't see ourselves as warfighting people. And so we think we have a very high threshold for conflict. This idea of competition means you got to get your hands dirty before it ever gets to that space. We think there's three elements in the concept that we recently published. This is multi-domain operations in 2028. Chief Staff of the Army signed it, but there's really three things I'd mention that we're doing left of conflict. And the first is we have to continually be countering information warfare and unconventional warfare. Right now, in many ways, we do it episodically, anecdotally, but a unified effort to contend with the unconventional warfare, information warfare that we see from our adversaries. The second one, and probably even more important, is this idea of operational prep of the environment. You know, in the 1980s, when we were up against the Soviets, you could do this fairly well with strategic intelligence. Satellite could see where garrisons are at. You could determine what the order of battle would be and line yourself up and prepare for that. But in this future environment, given the anti-access area denial problem, the integrated air defense, and this extended multiple layers of standoff, what you're really going after is systems and nodes, which is a fidelity of targeting that we are not used to, which requires you to stimulate those nodes and those systems so that you can identify them, see them, and then ultimately target them. So that if you have to rapidly transition to conflict to defeat a fait accompli attack, you could do it today. We won't have months to get our targets together. So this is an operational headquarters that's required to be stimulating these systems every day, which means force presence. And I could talk a little bit about that later, but you got to be there to do that.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the information environment and ask you more about that, because I do think, as we are in the competitive phase right now, it seems that many times we as the U.S. or our allies seem to be a little bit reactive in terms of information operations. And just curious if there's anything you're all doing to put more of a focus on that for our allies, for our own troops that are forward stationed in Europe, on how we could be more effective at information operations rather than being reactive, to try to be a little bit more proactive.
Yeah, John, I think this is a great point. One of the reasons we struggle with it is we see it as an afterthought. That's our history. The second thing is, when we wrote Air Land Battle in 1981, which drove our modernization, we always looked at things from a phase 3 or conflict environment forward. And we didn't look left. In fact, we talk about the competition space in here, and we were counseled, hey, maybe you should make that a separate document. And our argument is no, it's absolutely intimately linked to the conflict that follows. And what we find is that the special operations community embraces that, because what it does is it integrates that work long before you ever get to conflict. So the first thing I would point out is the fact that we put it in the Army's operational concept as part of our operational approach is the start point. Second thing I would mention is it has an aspect of policy to it. We can't do that unconventional warfare and information warfare and countering our adversaries without the interagency directly involved. And one of the reasons we struggle is we still follow, in many ways, a post-Westphalian approach that the nation-state has embraced, where the country team has independent coherence over the top of the information efforts. That's understandable, and that will continue. But an ability to bridge that is what we talk about, not only with the country teams of our nations, but also with our counterparts and allies. Clearly, European nations are going to have an opinion on unconventional warfare or countering it within their countries. Mr. Wild would tell us that, right? But we have to, through the NATO mechanism, create bridges so that you can create a coherent strategy now, which is what our adversaries are doing. They're well ahead of us.
Yes.
John, let me come to you now. The Army, U.S. Army, and the Air Force also, to a large extent, depends so much on the reserve component. National Guard and Reserve, I think of rounded off, 1 million-man U.S. Army, about 500,000 of that actually is not National Guard and Reserve. Since Vietnam, most of our logistical capability, engineers, many of the capabilities necessary for sustained land combat were moved into the reserve component by General Abrams when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, to make sure that the Army could never go to war again without America. I mean, that the Congress and every community would have to feel it and be involved in it. So it's been a huge success the way it's worked out. But is that model still relevant now as we look into the future that General Wesley and his organization are focused on? Has the Guard and has the Army Reserve kept up with these modernization efforts, not just in equipment, but multi-domain operations? How does the reserve component fit into that?
Yeah, great question on that. In terms of equipping, I think what the Army has done a really great job at is equipping the National Guard and Reserves with the same type of equipment that our active component brothers and sisters have. So that's great. I mean, it's not 100% across the board, but I think we've gotten a lot better doing that over the last 20, 25 years for sure. So that's a great benefit to our soldiers who will spill the same blood as an active component soldier would, so they deserve the same type of modern equipment, and again, our Army is doing that. Interesting in terms of something such as cyberspace and cyber teams. One thing the National Guard has done, most of the states have developed cyber teams. And in our last elections that we actually had National Guard cyber teams protecting the election process here in the United States. We also have something called the State Partnership Program, whereby in Europe there's 22 partnerships between National Guard states and either former Soviet republics, former Warsaw Pact countries, and other countries down in the Balkans. I think a very good case is the Maryland National Guard with their cyber defense team working with Estonia. And for anybody who knows anything about the Baltics, Estonia has a great reputation for cyber defense activities. And Maryland has been working with Estonians, and because Maryland is also a partner with Bosnia, they've actually been able to bring the Estonians and the soldiers from Bosnia together to work cyber activities along with Maryland. So I think with the State Partnership Program and the partnerships that have existed now in most of these countries for over 25 years, they've created this bond of trust with a lot of our Eastern European allies and partners. As a matter of fact, if you think back to, say, right after the Soviet Union collapsed, and the United States began to kind of take their eye away from Europe and pivot to the Pacific and other parts of the world. It was these National Guard states, through the State Partnership Program, that kept these relationships warm. And I think because these relationships were kept warm, that's one reason we've been, I think, so effective after 2014 in reestablishing ourselves with our NATO allies and other European partners.
So you were a Pennsylvania Guardsman for a very long time. Could you give a couple of examples of what Pennsylvania has done in Lithuania, for example, where you're the state partner?
Yeah, who would have thought, but just a few years ago, Pennsylvania Army National Guardsmen, Pennsylvania Air National Guardsmen, and Lithuanians all deployed together to Afghanistan to train Afghan police. So that was a multi-compo combined effort between Pennsylvania and Lithuania to actually deploy to Afghanistan to do that mission. We weren't the only partnership to do that. There were other partnerships that did the very same thing. So I think that just shows the evolution and the maturity of how far these partnerships have really gone when you could take soldiers from these various entities and have them deploy to do a very important mission like that.
Okay, and then one last question. You left being Deputy Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe just a few months ago and retired. At the time of your departure, what was sort of the profile of the National Guard and Reserve in Europe as part of Atlantic Resolve, all the different things that were going on? What are some of the contributions and things that were happening there?
Sure. Well, we have a National Guard Brigade Combat Team headquarters in Kosovo. We do have a National Guard Battalion from a brigade out of Tennessee, but they happen to be Pennsylvania National Guardsmen as part of the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Poland, in northeastern Poland. And then there are many other National Guard units that are deploying over to Europe as part of the heel-to-toe program in terms of maintenance units, air defense artillery units, long-range fire units from the National Guard are actually in Europe now on 9-month deployments to deter aggression there.
Okay. Well, when I come back to you in a little while, one of the topics that's certainly been discussed a lot over the past year is the idea of permanent basing, permanent forward presence, but yet you've explained all the different things that are in the Guard and Reserve, which are ideally suited for rotational employment. And so I'd like to come back to you and ask for your thoughts about how should our allies approach this when they ask for a U.S. presence, and as the U.S. thinks about employment, how do we do that?
Okay.
Now, one of our allies that has been an example of a great, speaking of state partnership, is between Illinois and Poland. So there's been soldiers from Illinois National Guard serving in Poland for decades, actually, long before U.S. Army Europe or rotational forces began to train in Poland. So, Mr. Wilt, what do you see as host nation responsibility? Poland has been very clear and also demonstrated commitment to provide resources for Americans and other allies to train, to stay in Poland. And thinking about your infrastructure responsibilities, host nation support, what are the kind of things that Poland thinks about that it should provide in terms of host nation support?
To answering your question, well, I'm responsible for the matters of transport, so I focus on the transport challenges, especially on the military mobility cases. But first, let me explain what is not military mobility. So first, military mobility is not a substitute of permanent presence. So to explain it, where do you want to have the policeman? On the future crime scene or 10 kilometers away with a perfect way between the crime scene? at the place when the policeman is. So it's not the same. It's not the same. But indeed, Poland, in the similar way, the whole Central Eastern Europe has a tremendous infrastructural gap. And to fix it is one of the main challenges we are facing in the Central Eastern Europe. To give you an example of it, it takes the same amount of time to travel across Poland in distance 600 kilometers, so it's a little bit less than 400 miles, than to fly from Warsaw to Seoul over 10 hours time. And try to imagine that you need to move the troops, and when every second matters, actually, not every minute, but every second matters. So we really think in that way. I'm responsible for the Solidarity Transport Hub program, which is both the biggest infrastructure investment after 1989 in Poland, 10 billion US dollars multimodal hub, and development of the railway network in Poland. While the railway network is so important, one example more, to completely block the passage of to the not only Suwałki corridor, but to the whole northeast border of Poland, you need to eliminate 2 bridges. And I'm not talking about big bridges. I'm talking about bridges which are capable to eliminate with one wing single shot. So this provides a challenge. This provides a challenge because we have to be ready, because, as I said before, our allies not are in a perfect position from our perspective. Our perspective is to have you permanently by your side, and but providing there is no permanent presence now. Yet we need to provide such infrastructure conditions in order to have you as quick as possible. And this is one of the main challenges. And we are taking the advantage of this new infrastructure program in order to meet all necessary military conditions in order to be prepared.
If I can reinforce something that Mr. Wild said, we agree. Well, I'll say it this way. In the concept, we talk about calibrated force posture. If you want to adequately defeat a fait accompli attack or compete left of conflict, I said you have to be there. So one of the things we would agree on is that the best kind of mobility is being there, right? And so you don't have to move if you can have forces there. We talk about calibrated force posture, and there's 4 elements. The first is this idea of force presence, rotational or permanent. But the degree to which we don't, all of us, all nations, don't invest in forward presence, you can imagine an exponentially higher cost to invest in expeditionary capacity. And that expeditionary capacity, I think, reinforces the networks, the bridging that you talk about.
So, Mr. Wild, how about in terms of infrastructure, of course, we've talked a little bit about the Solidarity Transport Hub, which, when it's completed, will significantly increase the ability for not only commercial, industrial traffic on rail and air and on the roads in Central and Eastern Europe, but clearly for alliance military movements. When you look at the map, Poland is kind of the pivot point. If the alliance has to go up into the Baltic region or if it has to go down towards the Black Sea region, Poland is the key sort of intersection for all that. What about other infrastructure development in the region? For example, between Poland and Lithuania. It seems to me Poland and Lithuania, this initiative that CEPA talks about, plus, P-L-U-S, Poland, Lithuania, U.S., if we can start solving pieces of the problem, improving the military mobility between Poland and Lithuania, where we know there's one big highway, one small road, and one railroad, and that's all there is. It goes up the Suwalki corridor. How does that factor into the planning that you're doing?
Well, first of all, thanks to CEPA, the broader audience heard about Suwalki Corridor Challenge because it is a challenge. It is a challenge because the single road to the Suwalki Corridor is much more narrow than Pennsylvania Avenue. So it's a challenge. But at the same time, working together with our Lithuanian partners, we are working on so-called Rail Baltica, which is a new railroad. The other project, which has already started last year, is so-called Via Carpatia, which binds together north and south, north-south direction. In the north-south direction, the countries of Central Eastern Europe. The other lately announced project we will deliver together with Romania is Rail to Sea project, which will bind Constanța and Polish harbors. So there is we are aware that we have plenty work to do, but what is crucial, I think that the level of awareness among the countries of Central Eastern Europe that we need to be integrated, both for civil and military purposes, is much bigger than it was some years ago. And this we may observe with a clarity now.
So let me ask one more question. It's about cyber. Who is responsible in Poland, if you can say, for the cyber protection of transportation infrastructure or for the Port of Gdansk? Is that under your ministry or is that a separate ministry? Who protects that?
Well, it's a difficult question because if you are speaking about the standards of security, which shall be met, this is intersectional challenge, and there is no standards to work on these standards is a challenge we have to face in the near future. But at the same time, not only by delivering STH project, which shall be actually the first greenfield airport project in Europe since 1993, so since Munich, since new airport in Munich. It's provide us the opportunity to use the newest technology. So skip over some stages of development. And using the same technology, not only on the STH, but also on other airports located in Poland, and then if it will pass the exam of functionality in other airports of in other airports of the Central Eastern region. We count on the cooperation with our allies because we fully acknowledge that the cybersecurity is one of the main challenges also from military perspective. And one word more, we work together closely with European Union, which acknowledges the need for the cybersecurity and covers the costs of the cybersecurity for the purpose of providing the military mobility on all airports which are located on the TNT network, so Trans-European network. It's a great progress in the terms of also awareness among the European countries.
Sure, thank you. So, General Wesley, Eric, if I come back to you, I got about 400 questions, but I won't give them all to you. But there's so many things to think about, and I'm glad that the Army has organized itself to think about it and put some serious leaders on this. First of all, I have always been confused. You hear people talk about hybrid warfare, you hear people talk about Gerasimov doctrine, you hear people talk about the gray zone, then you hear people talk about new generation warfare. We're all trying to put our arms around what the hell it is that the Russians are doing. It's our nature to try and put it in a category so we can understand it. Have y'all adopted, or has the Army said, okay, we're going to call this, whatever this thing is, we're going to call it this? Again, back to the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah. So to answer your question, the Russian New Generation Warfare study was intended to take a comprehensive look at how Russia approaches warfighting across the spectrum of conflict to include competition. When we talk about gray zone, active measures, hybrid warfare, typically we're talking about a narrower look, and that is what is left of conflict, which in many ways they have mastered the ability to achieve objectives that may even come into violate expectations of international norms, but still achieve them through this ability to employ anything from organized crime to ambiguous cyber attacks to any number of ambiguous actions that become provocative, where you ramp up to escalate and only to turn around and de-escalate and at a proper time. And this idea of constantly pushing the envelope before it rises to this threshold of conflict. But I guess there's a lot of different names. I mentioned 3 of them, all under the rubric Russian New Generation Warfare. But if you're looking for how we're going to fight in the future, or more importantly, how we deter, how we force Russia to recalculate, I think it's the 3 problems are most important in terms of understanding. What are the implications of the fact that we are now challenged in all domains? How do we change, if we're used to having ubiquitous communications, if we're used to having air supremacy and air superiority, and if those go away, how does that change? And I could talk about that. The second one, though, is this idea of multiple layers of standoff means we've got to penetrate that. And if you just want a simple idea of, we oftentimes say, if you're going to fight Evander Holyfield, who's got a long reach, you need a good posture, you need a good stance, and you need the ability to penetrate. That means you've got to have presence, and you have to have tools and means of fighting that allows you to penetrate these systems in order to disintegrate them and enable maneuver. All of that, those 3 problems that I talked about, all of that is what drove us to design the scheme of maneuver, the concept for how we fight in the future. And I think those 3 are the most important to remember. All the names, I think you can get confused on.
So, we've had the benefit of learning from Ukraine quite a bit over the last 3 or 4 years fighting against Russians. What are some of the lessons learned that we've taken from Ukraine, and how has that been applied back into our training and our future development?
At the tactical level, I think one of the things we can take away from Ukraine is that the time between Russian incursion into Georgia versus their incursion into the Donbas is that their ability to conduct sensor shooter operations with long-range, precision, massed, lethal fires was a significant improvement in 6 short years. So at the tactical level, I think that's probably one of the most significant that we can take a look at, and that's why the ideas that we talk about in multi-domain operations, which I could get into some detail on that, number one, require you to be significantly distributed in your ability to fight, the ability to move fast, your expectation of mobilizing and taking extended periods of time to stack metal in a port, and then like we're used to in the last 30 years, is not going to be useful. And then the idea of simultaneity, the idea that you have to force them to look in multiple directions so that single exquisite sensor-to-shooter LRPF effort is not as effective as it otherwise would be. Those are just a few that I would list.
What venues do we have for sharing all this with our allies? I mean, how does the Army make sure, since we're not going to be fighting on Mars, we're going to be fighting in the sovereign territory of allied nations, Poland, Lithuania, Romania, hopefully never, but I mean, potentially, that's what we're talking about. How does the interoperability with those allies and the infrastructure that they have, how does that factor into the thinking that Futures Command does?
So I think that first is we're on a roadshow continually. I just came back from Europe. One of the purposes is to explain and to communicate and educate on multi-domain operations. This is not a classified document, and the nations could get a hold of it. More importantly, though, I think that the way you really are able to determine appropriate interoperability is the mutual participation in exercises. The Defender series, most popular, and I think there's 17 different nations engaged in Defender 20. That's where we're going to validate, or confirm or deny whether we've got interoperability in our systems. And we're getting better, but we've got work to do. And then I think finally, RUSI, AUSA, these are venues where, and even this one, frankly, where we're sharing mutual ideas. Just came back from Poland, as we mentioned, and to see the opportunity, although not fully leveraged, to work with our allies and partners on training, even at the tactical level.
One gap that we seem to have besides the information environment is electronic warfare. The Russians, I think they put, if I'm not mistaken, a electronic warfare company into every brigade or every battalion size element, and we obviously, don't do that. Is there any thought as you're working through some of these multi-domain issues and challenges in getting more EW, electronic warfare units, integrated into U.S. formations, and have you taken a look at what some of our allies are doing with those type of formations?
Yeah, so two things. One is that, first is context. When the wall fell back a generation ago, one of the things we did was we divested all of our electronic warfare capability. And what our adversaries did is they continued to invest. And so we find ourselves playing catch up right now in a significant way. But it is one of our fundamental investment areas just beyond the 6 modernization priorities. So a significant curve in terms of our investment strategy. It will be imperative that we get in that space. Not only our ability to employ it, but our ability to template what our adversaries are doing. I think that our peers, our coalition partners and allies, have taught us as much as we need. The Australians are doing some great work in this space. The Brits even are doing some great work in this space. And so I think it's got to be a mutual effort. Yeah.
So I want to give my microphone handlers a heads up. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions. So let me just ask one more thing, and then I'm going to come back to it. These two young teenagers right here, Janusz and, right, you'll be my first 2 guys, okay? So Eric, let me ask this one last question. As you watch this attack on the Saudi oil refinery here by the Houthis, backed by Iranian technology, I mean, the devastation, apparently, that was delivered by drones. I know you guys were already thinking about these kinds of possibilities, but I mean, what do you think about that? What's the Army's role in either protecting ourselves, but also protecting allies against those kinds of attacks, which obviously this won't be the last one?
I think the number one thing you take away from the situation in Saudi Arabia is it's days later, and there are some still debating who was responsible. That's fundamental it's a fundamental change. The introduction of ambiguity into the battlefield has created more standoff because it reduces your ability and time to respond.
Great point.
We see this continually with the hybrid warfare problem or the active measures. And so we're not just going to see it coming from the Iranians. In fact, what we're concerned about is we will find the outcome of a given operation to be a fait accompli before we've even realized the source of the operation. So what we see in that situation is going to be and is continually applied by our adversaries, China and Russia. And I think that the takeaway is we have to be willing to challenge those things every single day. And sometimes it will get into gray space. And that's what policymakers, I think, you will see them wrestle with that in the ensuing years.
Counter-drone capabilities that are coming into the field?
Well, let me finish up the other thought. And the degree to which we give authorities to operational commanders to counter them immediately as opposed to sorting out who's really responsible for this. That is part of our air missile defense investment, one of our 6 modernization priorities. Significant area of investment is the idea of swarming drones and counter-drone.
Okay, thanks. So, Janusz. Okay, I'm sorry, I forgot. Janusz, I beg your pardon. Per was hiding, big gigantic Dane is hiding behind my podium here. I promised you the first question, Per, please, and then Janusz coming to you.
Could I point out something first? I did ask 2 questions, so I'm in the running for this gin and tonic competition.
I don't want to compete, so. Thank you, sir, and thanks for some good thoughts already from the panel. I'm Brigadier General Per Knudsen. I work for the NATO Supreme Allied Commander down in Norfolk, and I'm stationed here in the DC as his liaison officer to the Pentagon. The former U.S. Secretary of Defense and the former commander of ACT, Honorable James Mattis, he often said that future wars will be won by coalitions and future conflicts will be solved with allies and partners. So therefore, interoperability and cohesion is obvious issues to address. In addition, I know that our moderator, General Hodges, worked hard on interoperability issues as commander of the U.S. Army Europe. And you use the rotating U.S. forces and the NATO enhanced 4 present battle groups as examples on how to achieve better interoperability. And that goes for all the 4 battle groups stationed in Poland and each of the 4 Baltic states, and trying to increase interoperability, speed, cohesion, etc. So thus, even on the tactical level, we face substantial challenges regarding interoperability and cohesion. And this includes command and control, which to some degree can be related to the use of different generations of communication systems and other equipment, which again can be related to each nation, each coalition partner's economical ability and allocation of financial resources to their national budgets. So that leads me to the question to the panel, and especially you, General Wesley. The mentioned need for future multi-domain capabilities to conduct future warfare at the tactical, operational, and strategic level in the gray zone and at war against a near-peer adversary. That requires substantial investments in high-tech, expensive capabilities for use in all domains, but some capabilities and domains, especially space, will be a bridge too far for some nations, and even future high-tech capabilities in more traditional domains will be a huge challenge and burden for some nations. So my question goes, how do we acquire the needed future high-tech capabilities without losing the ability to establish interoperability and cohesion among coalition partners?
Fantastic question. How given the different resources everybody has, how do you still push the limit on capability without losing cohesion? So that's the first one, Eric, so I'll come back to you on that. Janusz?
Hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you. Very informative, instructive panel, actually. I have a very simple question, particularly to the General. Have we considered and planned for the possibility of a simultaneous attack or a simultaneous multi-dimensional attack by Russia and China, vis-a-vis NATO, vis-a-vis the United States, which could take the form of maybe a diversion by one in some region to enable a more forceful attack by the other party, or the possibility of a simultaneous attack on neighbors that they've coveted. In other words, Taiwan for China and Ukraine for Russia. Are we beginning to consider that possibility and how we would react to that, start planning for that?
Thanks. So do we have a strategy and resources to be able to deal with simultaneous attack? And then Hans Benedict, you had this will be our third question, then we'll try and answer some of these.
So I'd like to ask a little bit about deterrence. We've come a long way since 2014, and Ben has been very helpful in doing that when he was in command there, with the battle groups, with the VJTF, the NRF, the mobility initiative, the readiness initiative. It's all part of an effort to deter. But as you go through the Baltic states,
Go through what?
as you go through the 3 Baltic states, they are very happy to have these 1,000, 1,200 person battle groups there, but they all say the same thing at the end of the day. We need some American boots on the ground. There's nothing like some Americans present to deter. You've talked about, General, you've talked about forward presence, the importance of that. We had Army companies there before the battle groups went in. We don't have them now. We have a small number of soft dispersed there. I understand, and I may be wrong about this, I understand that the Army has some objections to putting Army forces back into the Baltic states for command and control reasons, for unit integrity reasons, et cetera. Why shouldn't we be putting in maybe a company or two of American troops in each of the Baltic states, perhaps soft units? I know there's some guard there, but occasionally. Either soft units or distance fires or air defense. There are a lot of different functions they could play, but the important thing is to get some Americans in there to enhance deterrence. That's my question. Why do we do that?
Yeah,
and
thanks.
if the Army really is objecting to it, why?
So with Hans' question, Eric, I don't want to put you in a position to have to address a policy decision that's outside your responsibility, but maybe you could talk in answering that good question about what are the considerations for how the Army recommends to the department what we might do. So let's take one more right there. Yes, sir.
You're stretching my brain here.
I've got them. I've written them down for you. And the good thing about this technique, you just picked the two that you just, okay.
So I'm Jakub Skiba from War Studies University, Warsaw, Poland. I think my question is in that sense, what is actually the philosophy of the American military presence in Poland and in the Baltic states? For me, it's not clear, because I don't think that we have to do right now with confidence building between NATO and Russia. It's over after 2014. I think right now the situation is different. So politically, the goals are different of the United States. But what is the purpose? Is it deterrence? Deterrence, I mean, raising the risk of attacking for Russians with no real capabilities to defend. Or it is rather real defense. If it is the second case, of course, so there must be common perspective between allies, okay? Because to be honest with you, we in Poland still, we don't know what is the goal of Americans. And there's the great question. Is really United States ready to fight in case of attack, or rather we must be prepared, Poland, in Baltic states, to take other measures. So now, I think it is the time
All right, sir.
to answer this question.
We've stacked up General Wesley's plate here with 4 questions. I think the 4th one is, you just came from Poland. Eric, it's probably fresh in your mind. Why don't you take a stab at those, and then John, I'll actually come back to you also, maybe particularly on that last question, if you want to add to it.
Sure. So I think I'm going to start over with the deterrence question, because that goes to the basic academic aspect of what we're doing here. And you might have picked up on what I mentioned earlier, that by virtue of our withdrawal from the continent and the peninsula and some of these investments that our adversaries are making, that the effect is a diluted deterrence. What does that mean? Well, the strategic deterrence is effective because massive retaliation, if there's an existential threat, will work. But if underneath that umbrella, our adversaries are achieving their strategic objectives counter to our own national security interests, we might be interested in that. But if we're interested in it and we can't influence it, that means we have an operational level deterrence problem. So how do you increase your operational deterrence? And really there's 2 things. One is, I think you need to be able to expand the competition space. The National Defense Strategy talks about this. To expand the competition space, that means you need to, if you're concerned about what happens in the Donbass, if you're concerned what happens in the Sea of Azov, if you're concerned about what happens in some of the capitals in the Baltics, and you want to affect it, you got to be there. And so this idea of expanding the competition space allows us to increase our level of deterrence. Why? Because they know we're there, we know we want to contend them, which forces maybe a recalculation. If that fails, what about a fait accompli attack? Do we have the capacity now to defeat a fait accompli attack? You got to ask yourself that. Or are we signing up for a massive mobilization to reverse the efforts of a fait accompli attack, in which case you're signing up for a protracted conflict, which nobody wants? So the ability to fight defeat a fait accompli attack and expand the competition space, now you're getting to operational level deterrence, I think. You have to ask whether we have the capacity to do that now, which brings me back to this question over here on the issue of what about simultaneity? Clearly, we know that things are global now. The chairman talks about this, and we talk about a global deterrence capacity, which means we have to consider the puts and takes. The whole idea of competing is to not allow it to get to that point. The whole idea of having sufficient operational deterrence is why we don't want to get into that space. But if you can get forward in a forward position environment, if you can deter that effort, even if it gets ugly once in a while, far better than if you're mobilizing from the continental United States or other nation to engage in a protracted conflict. It's to defeat that requirement in many ways. And I can pull a thread on that if you're interested. But what is the interest of the United States? I think it's clear. It's to assure and deter. And we have to ask ourselves, to what degree are we able to do that across NATO in an effective measure? And measure that and make the adjustments accordingly.
All right, John, go ahead, and then we still need to answer the question that Perry asked.
Just to comment on that, I think the U.S. interest in Europe is clear. I think, if I'm not mistaken, this year in our budget it's $6.5 billion on the European Deterrence Initiative funding. $6.5 billion is a tremendous amount of money. We are rotating rotational forces into Europe. I mean, they leave their families for at least 9 months when they go over to Europe to participate in the rotational force program there. So that's a commitment on the part of our Army. So I think we're firmly committed. In terms of the Baltics, yes, we did have companies, I believe, from the 173rd there right after 2014 until the decision was made for NATO to put the enhanced forward presence battle groups in those countries. I mean, the Baltic countries asked for those EFP battle groups. And I think there could be an argument made that if we kept permanently present U.S. forces in those countries along with the NATO battle groups, it could take a little bit of the credibility away from NATO. I mean, they do have 1,200 soldier battle groups from various NATO countries in each one of those countries. Of course, there's framework nations in each one. The other thing with our special operations forces, it may not be completely permanent, but it's pretty continuous episodic presence from our soft units. And then with Defender 20, we're going to be sending over, I believe, at least one full division to participate in Defender 20 in Poland and in the Baltics. Not to mention, as you rightly pointed out, the relationship between the National Guard states and the 3 Baltic countries. So I would push back a little bit to say that we're not doing, maybe we could do a little bit more there, but I think we are doing quite a bit to show Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that we do support them.
Eric, do you mind addressing General Knudsen's question about the disparity, U.S. technology? Do we risk creating too many gaps with allies with whom we need to be cohesive?
Yeah, Per, thanks for the question. Oftentimes when I've spoken on this, typically from one of our NATO allied partners, they say, okay, you're going to invest a lot here and there's some exquisite weapon systems. How do we fit into that? A few points I would make is, the first is, how do we fit in that? What can we do? The first is, we found in all of our modeling and experimentation and simulation that the technical capabilities that we bring to the battlefield are less important than how we fight. When we compare and contrast our baselines in all this analytics, we can bring all the exquisite weapon systems into play, and if we fight them the same way we always have, you get a marginal gain. But if you fight differently, using even to include some of our legacy systems, you do a lot better. And so there's always going to be varying degrees of capacity within nations, even within the United States. We talk about the speed of technology. There's going to be haves and have-nots, and how we define that will be a tactical and operational question, but you've always got to have different capabilities integrated into your force. The second thing I would say, so what can you do? I oftentimes tell, there's different nations are good at different things. And the degree to which nations can leverage their niche capabilities as part of a larger campaign will be absolutely critical. Third point I would make is those, particularly NATO countries that are within Europe, I think that you heard me talk a lot about competition and the concern about time and the concern about expeditionary movements. You're there. So we think that your role in the competition space, and that is to counter the UW, the IW, to conduct the operational preparation of the environment, to conduct the stimulations necessary to be targeting in order to transition rapidly, that's got to be the responsibility of those who are there. To the degree the U.S. is, we will have to do that, but I think that's largely a European requirement. And then, sir, if I can just say one thing, host nation support is indispensable, and the willingness to be liberal on your ability to support, I think, will help us. Sorry for going long.
So, second round of questions, and I've got 1, 2, 3. All right, so this young lady right here, go ahead.
Thank you. Dorota Kolarska, Transatlantic Future Leaders Forum. So, first and foremost, thank you for your discussion. My question is going to be on the future of warfare and cybersecurity, because I think we can all agree that authoritarian governments around the world are developing cyber warfare capabilities. But there's surprisingly little discussion about the fact that Western companies are actually contributing to that development. So it was only a few weeks ago that the US Department of State published a draft guidance for the export of hardware, software, and technology with surveillance capabilities. And while it constitutes an important step, the guidance is not intended to be mandatory and is not meant to address any requirements under export control laws.
So what's the question? Because we only got a couple minutes.
And at the same time, EU states voted against similar regulations. So my question is, would you agree that technology exports constitute a significant threat to our security? And if so, do you think there's any potential to stop technology leaks to authoritarian governments? Or are any such actions fruitless? And we should focus on developing protection capabilities instead.
Okay, sure.
I'm Julian Fata from Romania. My question is on this important topic about blurring the dividing line between war and peace. And I have in mind the specific case of Saudi Arabia being attacked by Iran. So Iran attacked militarily Saudi Arabia, but in the same time, I believe that Iran attacked politically US, challenging your capacity and your political will to defend one of your allies. So my question is it possible to guarantee the security of Saudi Arabia and to protect your ally without declaring war to Iran and responding with military force?
All right, this will be a piece of cake. All right. Mr. Gentleman.
Thank you. I hope this is working. You can hear
Go
me.
ahead.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a great conversation. My name is Dorian. I'm a managing partner of URAD Monitor, which is an IoT strategic solution aimed for detecting national security threats and responses related to air quality and radiation. My question is related to telecommunication infrastructure, and if you can comment a little bit about 5G technology and its impact on armed forces deployment in Europe. Thank you.
Good, thank you. And then, Michael, you get the last question.
Hi, Paul Joyle, NSI. My question
you'll
is
still
on,
get the last question.
is on the insider threat. We know that insider threats can take down systems. Counterintelligence is different than in my day. A well-placed insider can light up systems that should be dark, can shut down things that should be lit up, and could dramatically affect a future battlefield. What is being done to ensure that NATO is taking these threats? We've seen many espionage suspects that have been identified. Thank you.
Thank you, good question. All right, Michael.
There's a super tough competition for this gin and tonic from you, Ben. Quick question to you, General. You were talking about the left of conflict space. I wanted to ask you, you talked about the permanent, not presence, but being fighting in the competition space of the spectrum. My question here is, have we done and can we do more when it comes to cyber and info operations, not defensively, but actually being a little bit more offensive vis-a-vis our adversary? Are you thinking about it? Can you share with us what are the options? And Ben, if I can pull you into the discussion, I mean, we talked about capacities of various allies. One ally we haven't mentioned that seems quite important for the defense of the eastern flank is Germany. If you could, given that you're there and you know the country well, if you could tell us how confident you are that what kind of force do we need in Germany? Let's put it this way. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Michael. So we've got actually, I think, 3 questions that are tech-oriented technology, cyber, 5G, insider threat. So maybe we could kind of group those together a little bit. Eric, you take a crack at it, and then either Mr. Veld or John, if you want to add to that, it's totally your call. But why don't you take those, and then we'll come back to recommendations to the White House about how to deal with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I'll turn to Sydney. You'll take that one for us, okay? If you don't mind.
Being not a technical expert, I was going to punt all those to John, but I will try to find one that's useful. To the last question here, have we thought about the use of cyber? And I'll address it in terms of what we're looking at into the future. And it goes back to what I opened with. If you are contested in all domains, the way you create overmatch is to stack them so that the total is greater than the sum of the parts. And we see that employed by our adversaries quite continually. So those 2 points lead you to infer that you've got to get into that space if you want overmatch and you don't want to be attacked yourself. What we've got to solve in the ensuing years is to get after the authorities question. How do you get the authorities necessary to leverage not just cyber, but also space, et cetera, assets against your adversary, not necessarily to attack in a lethal manner, but to compete, to your point. And we think that ultimately we're going to be able to define parameters for this under certain conditions where you can have the agility to leverage certain tools in order to continually push back on the challenges that we see.
Just to talk about something. I'm not sure if it's been talked about this morning because I wasn't here this morning, but spectrum management is also a big thing. And if we're going to work with and train with our allies in Europe, and if we're going to train as we're going to fight if we have to, I do think we have to do a better job with getting all of our allies on board with spectrum management issues. There's some systems that we cannot train on over in Europe simply because of some spectrum management challenges that I think would be great if we could maybe do a little bit better job tearing into that. And sir, I don't know if you have
John,
anything
if I
to say
could just
on that.
reinforce what you're saying, and not just with our partners and allies, but back at any given home station. One of the things as we modernize the Army, we've got a holistic approach as to how we move to an MDO environment. One of the tasks is who at AXAM, our garrison or installation management agency, who talks to the FAA about how we're going to train on the electromagnetic spectrum at home station? Well, that's going to be true for our coalition partners and allies, and synchronizing that is a really big task. So that's a good point.
Right, something I think we have to get better at. And then other things, our allies investing in Type 1 radios, many of them haven't. Bringing secure fills to training, which again, some countries just do not allow for that. So there's certain issues, looking at what could we do right now, those are some things I think we need to take a look at.
I think we can't possibly answer the question about Iran and Saudi Arabia, but I think, Eric, you made a great point. The fact that we couldn't confirm who actually did it highlights the challenge of speed of recognition. Certainly the Russians know that NATO depends on consensus, and the longer they can delay decisions, that ambiguity buys them time to accomplish what they need to do. And so that really is an important takeaway from that. Let me just take one stab at the question about Germany. Germany is an essential ally. Its location, its geography, it's the transportation hub, the launching pad for the alliance. For everybody in Western Europe and from North America can't get to the front without German support. Ports of Bremerhaven, airports, and so on. So I think thinking about Germany no longer being on the front line on the inter-German border when East and West Germany were facing each other, that line has moved way to the east. So I think the expectation for what we need Germany to provide is different. Clearly, it's unacceptable that a great nation like Germany, with their economy, is spending as little as they are on defense. But if we change the narrative a little bit, instead of just constantly kicking them in the ass all the time about what they spend, tell them what we need. Clearly, readiness has to be number one. I mean, there's no excuse for the Bundeswehr to be where it is in terms of readiness. They know how to do this. So they've got to put investment in readiness. But then cyber protection, I worry about cyber protection for Nuremberg Airport, Munich Airport, Frankfurt Airport. There's not a Ministry of Defense person that has a finger on that, or the Port of Bremerhaven. That's essential for all of us. And I think the Germans could take on air and missile defense. This is about protecting European citizens and European infrastructure, and that's not controversial. But I think they are doing a lot more than maybe we realize. The new NATO Joint Sustainment Enabling Command headquarters at Ulm just declared IOC, Initial Operational Capability, the other day. That's fast for a big giant institution like our alliance. That's pretty fast. So we need Germany to be to ensure effective deterrence. Okay, so I think first of all, thanks very much to this panel for taking a wide range of hard questions and effectively dodging 3 or 4 of them that were unanswerable or were not in the lane, but a great job doing that. And I appreciate the level of interest in here. Frankly, there's a challenge sometimes on a late afternoon of a panel. And I know you'd all rather be out there marching in a climate parade so you could get school off tomorrow. The fact that you came here to participate in this, CEPA is very grateful. So please join me in applause for this team.